Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second installment of our series, Stand with the Facts. I'm Kim Malcolm with KUOW. And together with the Center for an Informed Public, our goal is to empower you, our audience, to be informed news consumers. We hope these conversations will help inform our audience on what mis and disinformation is and how it's spreading. And we're offering you a toolkit to spot misinformation, to combat it in our daily lives. Got more details on that in the links to this episode. We are taking your questions, so if you're watching live, please leave them in the comments and I will get to as many as I can. There is a lot of information shared on social media, information that is not always factual. And in these highly tumultuous times of social unrest during a global pandemic, there's even more of it being shared than before. That can have a big impact on our lives, which leads us to ask, what can platforms do to stop the spread of misinformation without infringing on the right to free speech? I'm joined today by Ryan KUOW, principal investigator at the Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington, and an associate professor at the UW School of Law to discuss what tech companies and lawmakers can do. Ryan, welcome.
Thanks so much for doing this.
You betcha. Well, we're going to be addressing some of the questions from our audience, but first I just want to touch on a few of the biggest themes that are circulating in the days since George Floyd died while having a police officer's knee on his neck. Hundreds of thousands of people have marched since then in all 50 states, millions around the world. I don't want to amplify the untruths that are out there, but for those of us who have not seen them in our feeds, I just want to give a little taste of what's out there. For instance, that George Floyd is alive and that reports of his death are a hoax, that George Soros, the billionaire that gives to democratic and liberal causes, that he's been conspiring to fund these protests, and that Antifa activists are behind riots and property destruction during some protests. That got a little more oxygen when President Trump tweeted that those people were responsible for the unrest. Ryan, what do you make of these types of rumors that are circulating right now and why there are so many of them?
Well, great question. So, let me just start by acknowledging that, George Floyd is the more recent and more visible individual who has died at the hands of police or others who are acting in that capacity. In 1999, I still remember Amadou Diallo. Mm-hmm. And so it's incredible, since that time that we haven't made the kind of progress that I wish we had. So I just want to acknowledge that and at the outset. But yes, this current moment is a huge source of misinformation and disinformation, and these are not new phenomenon, and they tend to occur when everybody's paying attention to a particular event, and information is getting out there at an incredibly fast pace, right? And so I'm not at all surprised to see that so much misinformation and so many lies are attending this national crisis. There's that famous quote attributed to Mark Twain about how lies make it all the way around the world before the truth puts on its shoes. And I think that as people are sharing information, watching what's unfolding, this becomes an opportunity for those longtime purveyors of disinformation to inject bad stuff. And we see it in this situation, we've seen it in the pandemic, and we saw it in many contexts prior.
Right. Can you, just speaking about the George Floyd stories that we're seeing out there, can you give us an example of what kinds of disinformation that you're seeing out there right now?
Oh, gosh, absolutely. So first of all, I want to be clear that sometimes the people that are doing disinformation are not even original, right? I mean, the notion that, for example, one piece of disinformation out there is that the Democratic Party is somehow distributing kind of riot and protest manuals to tell protesters how to cause dissent and foment destruction and the like. That is a recurrent source of, you saw that in previous similar situations as well.
Mm.
That for some reason Soros, is a recurrent target. We also saw in the pandemic situation a resurfacing of an old video that purported to be Bill Gates talking to the CIA about how he wants to put some kind of control serum in vaccines. And the video was from a decade or more ago, but it's resurfacing in this context, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also the purveyors of disinformation are capitalizing on the moment. So for example, there was a hashtag that was called DC Blackout, which was trying to spread the rumor that the DC police were somehow interrupting the communications of protesters so that they were unable to be on Twitter and social media and unable to communicate with each other. That there was this massive protest going on, but nobody knew about it because of this technology that was blocking that out, right? And often there is not even a kernel of truth in that. I mean, that wasn't true. However, in other situations, in other countries, and indeed in the United States at times, you have seen sometimes cell phone traffic being shut off. For example, in San Francisco in the BART system, at one point there was traffic, cell phone traffic shut off. And so there's a veneer of plausibility to some of these things. But I think it's important to remember that speaking of a playbook, there is a bit of a playbook, right? I mean, these are things where it's like, you're going to try to make people panic. You're going to say something that just sounds plausible, that maybe reaffirms people's fears, and you're going to hope it takes off and goes viral before the truth has an opportunity to put on its shoes.
Right. I know that there was a particular example around Blackout Tuesday. Do you have any thoughts on that one? That one was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so basically one of the strategies that disinformers adopt is that they take something legitimate and real, a hashtag, an event, an effort, and they try to co-opt it and change it, right? And so I'm not sure if viewers can see that well enough, but basically you have an effort that is sponsored by real protesters and real organizers, and then there's a copy made of it that looks enough like the original that people start to share it, but it contains misinformation. Maybe it's something actionable like where to donate money or when to vote or where to vote, right? And the effort is one to try to co-opt the conversation. You also see that with hashtags online, where there's a hashtag that maybe the protesters are using to talk to one another, or a particular population wants to voice their concerns, and then it becomes flooded with not good faith conversation in order to drown out that signal and fill it up with noise. And so it's incredible how fast and how ingenious some of the disinformers are when it comes to just taking what people are rallying around and then trying to pervert it and trying to move it over.
Right. And my question, I guess, is, so when there's such a volume and it's in so many different categories, different varieties of misinformation and disinformation, I mean, what do Facebook and Twitter do when items like this are posted and when they're being circulated? What do they do?
Yeah, so the social media companies have taken a number of different tactics that would be almost too many to enumerate here, right? But they roughly these kinds of things. So first of all, I try to identify and take down certain kinds of content that violate their terms of service or their community guidelines, right? And they do that with a combination of techniques, one of which is allowing you to flag something, and then if it's flagged often enough, a human reviewer will look at it and say, this is hate speech, this is a disinformation of some kind, this is trying to, mislead you about the coronavirus, right? They also have techniques of artificial intelligence like machine learning that tries to train on known misinformation to identify new misinformation, almost the same way that like an email spam filter might like sort of learn what spam is and then identify it. Again, trying to surface things and take them down. But in addition to that, they've also tried, especially with the coronavirus, actually, have tried to elevate good information. right? Because remember, we just began by saying that one of the key problems is that bad information is traveling faster than good information, right?
Mhm.
And so one of the techniques that Twitter and Facebook have used have been to try to surface good information. How do they do that? Well, maybe they give that little verified check mark to epidemiologists, which they've been actively doing, right, on
Mhm.
Twitter. Or maybe like with Facebook, they actually have like a COVID-19 hub, or they specially host content from the World Health Organization, just to try to give people a place to go where they can feel like they can have some trust in the content. Now, in addition to like taking stuff down and then at the extreme actually blocking participants, the platforms have also been experimenting with just giving you a warning saying, look, this violates our terms of service. This likely isn't true. A very big prominent warning so that you know when you're reading something that, gosh, somebody looked at it and it doesn't look right. These and many more are the techniques that they're using, and they're still evolving. But even so, it doesn't feel like it's enough. It doesn't feel like it's actually addressing the core problem.
Yeah, and we're certainly not the first ones to comment on this, but it's like the place where we are was created wide open, and now they're trying to put restrictions in on the back end. It's a little bit of reverse engineering, so to speak, and humans are trying to keep up as best they can.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that there was a kind of idealism, when the internet was first architected and when these social media platforms first emerged, that you got to let 1,000 flowers bloom, without appreciating just how much opportunity there would be for harm. And incidentally, I want to connect. I mean, misinformation is one kind of harm out there, disinformation, misinformation, but also think about all the people, especially women and people of color, who have to endure just torrents of abuse whenever they try to speak. So it's not just the misinformation, disinformation. It's also like purposive harassment, and so these social media platforms are having to, as you say, after the fact, sort of bolt on safeguards because the basic infrastructure is so open and the business model.
Right.
So
Well,
reward. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
sorry. So I'm glad you raised the issue of hate speech, and I definitely want to get to that later. But just to follow on what you were saying about how, they allowed 1,000 flowers to bloom, and there was some attempt at trying to get, a legal framework around this new technology when it came up, these new platforms. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because that has basically been what we've been trying to work with in the years since, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting story, Kim. I mean, so in the early days of the commercial internet, right, just a few years in, Congress passed a law called the Communications Decency Act. And as the name suggests, it was trying to get some decency in the communications. Now, it went about it in a profoundly unwise way. For example,
So,
for example, the Communications Decency Act wanted to kind of divide the internet into like zones, and like you couldn't go into this zone unless you were an adult, and you had to, what I mean. It was not exactly a speech friendly way of going about. It was very puritanical, I would say. But anyway, it was this attempt to sort of clean up the internet. And what happened was that the Supreme Court spectacularly struck down this law for purposes of whether the law violated the First Amendment. It was a 9-0 decision. Okay.
yeah.
And 9 out of 9. And so, but one piece of the Communications Decency Act survived, and it's this piece called Section 230. And what's fascinating about it is that Section 230 was the one part of the Communications Decency Act that actually immunized platforms like Facebook, or back in the day, AOL, or whatever it was, Twitter, for what users post on the platform. And so, as you can see on the slide, what it basically said was that Facebook or Twitter or whatever, they're not going to be treated like the publishers of things that third parties say on their platform. Okay. with a couple small exceptions, but by and large. And this has been, especially as interpreted by the courts, this has given an enormous amount of immunity to the Facebooks and Twitters for what users do on their platform. In addition, Section 230 protects platforms that take steps to try to clean up the environment, okay? And sometimes that's not always awesome. So for example, there was an example where Facebook was trying to impose its real name policy, making sure that everybody really had a real name and was really the person that they claimed. And they did this sweep, rejecting a bunch of profiles that weren't real names. And they wound up sweeping in First Peoples, Native Americans, because the names that were listed sounded unlike, they sounded like sentences or groups of words. And Facebook kicked them all out, or many of them out. And they couldn't face liability for doing that, even if it was deeply disruptive to those people, because they get immunized by the Good Samaritan clause of 230. So what we have today is the protections for the platforms, but none of the, again, at the time, unwise restrictions that would have come with Communications Decency Act.
Right. Which leaves people in a bit of a pickle then, because, we read things that are disturbing to us that, or even like more strongly than that, they're simply not true. But this seems to be part of the deal that we struck a long time ago with social media platforms.
It doesn't. So so far I've been giving you a pretty sort of straight, just the facts, stand with the facts, man, just the facts sort of, yes, kind of idea. But I'm going to do a little editorializing right now. Okay. This is Ryan Kalo talking.
We'll put that label on there. Okay.
Warning, guys making stuff up. No, but I'm not speaking for the center. I'm just speaking for myself here, just to say, I think part of it has to do with the aggressive way that the courts have interpreted 230, because all 230 really says is Facebook can't be treated as the speaker about the things that people say on Facebook. So Kim, if I go on Facebook and I say something defamatory about you, you can't sue Facebook over it. You got to come sue me.
I have to see you. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But it has been used to shield platforms for all kinds of other activities. So imagine if the theory that we have is Facebook, Google, Twitter, Microsoft, whoever, you're not doing enough to address disinformation on your website, right? Or when you serve political advertisements, you need to have certain safeguards in place, or you need to keep a record of who's asking for what advertisements, or what advertisements you're showing to what people, any number of different things. Those are all regulations, requirements that go to the behavior of Facebook. They're not about, you see what I'm saying? Like, so for example, imagine, so you can get in trouble as a company if you have inadequate security. If you have terrible security and you have lots of users and that lets hackers come in and steal your information, you get in trouble. You're not being treated like the hacker. No one's saying that you, Twitter, broke into your own system and stole people's identities, right? That's not the claim. The claim is you just were too lax. You didn't do enough. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
And so I think there are probably many kinds of accountability measures and many ways we can tinker with incentives that don't really run up against 230. But anytime you go to one of these companies and you say, you should be doing something different, you're going to get in trouble here. Oh, it's 230, it's 230, because of the, again, aggressive and expansive ways that most courts have interpreted that law.
Right. There's a lot to unpack there. We are in a presidential year though. So I just want to highlight the fact that even more so than 4 years ago in 2016, Americans are getting their news more than ever from social media feeds. And it's, for the most part, I understand it's Facebook. Facebook did get pushback 4 years ago. Of course, all of us remember about the Russian-sponsored campaign misinformation that got revealed later on. You're talking about that there are some specific ways that the companies can be pressured to change their practices. Can you talk a little bit about what happened after the last presidential election and what has substantially changed since then, and how the companies operate and how far they've gone?
Well, that's a great question. So I think it's both fair to say that the companies have responded to that election by putting in additional safeguards, right? and also to say that they've been heavily critiqued for not doing enough. They hired many people. They've had certain kinds of rules. I mean, Facebook has steadfast as a company. We've seen that not everybody at Facebook is on board with this, but as a company officially, they've taken a pretty hard line in terms of saying, we're going to host political ads and we're not going to fact check them. You know what I mean?
And that has caused not a small amount of disruption within the company. And we're starting to learn more about that, about how employees are feeling about this now.
Yeah, and maybe we can turn to that immediately next. I mean, what I was just going to say is that in terms of specifically attacks from Russian disinformation, they've built in some resilience against that, right? But the phone calls coming from inside the house, you know what I mean? In other words, like, it's not all Russian disinformation, and there's also a lot of really bad faith advertising and claims happening that are domestic in nature, and even by the politicians themselves. And so what you're referring to about, there's been recently, just in the last week, there's been reporting about dissatisfaction on the part of Facebook employees with allowing some of President Trump's content to remain up, though it clearly violates Facebook's user policy, community guidelines, right? So for example, the president is saying, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, and that sounds like a true threat. It sounds like a threat of violence. And it's the sort of thing that if I said it, they could block me. You know what I mean? They would kick me out if it came to the attention. And the arguments the arguments around that are really fascinating and, in my view, hard and powerful, because Mark Zuckerberg and some people around him, ultimately the decision makers, are saying, look, the president said it. If we take it down, people won't be able to scrutinize this thing that he said that is deeply problematic, right? I mean, people should see that he said it. It's a part of the record. He said it. We're not going to erase the record and so on. Whereas the other camp is saying, why should the especially powerful, right, get to break the rules? Why should their content remain up when the people who don't have such a great voice, such a big voice in the world, their stuff gets taken down for violating the guidelines? You see what I mean? Now, Twitter has, in essence, tried to find a middle way. So they'll leave something up, but they might limit how it's shared, or they might put a big banner around it that says, this violates our policies and here's why. And so they're just experimenting with how to deal with that tension between, not erasing the warts and not erasing the more than warts, the just sort of incredibly, sort of scary, damaging rhetoric that some politicians are engaged in. And on the one hand, and also, like, being consistent and respectful in the way that they treat their users.
And so how do you think they're doing? I mean, if they're experimenting with different techniques, different paths, I mean, are you seeing anything that indicates a way towards greater success or more accountability to their users, one over the other?
Yeah, so I think that over the years, I mean, so I should just be clear, I'm law professor. I helped to found this center, and my colleagues are deep empirical and longstanding researchers of misinformation. So I'm getting this from the Kate Starbards and the Jevin West and the Emma Spiros and of the world, and Chris Coward. But what I'll say is that that what you see over time is that when a company is highly motivated to put an end to something, okay, and that thing can be defined, like you can say what it is. They've been really good at it. Okay, so for example, you just don't see like online gambling advertisements the way you once did, right? You just don't see jihadi recruitment videos the way that you once did. And that has to do with the fact that there are federal laws prohibiting that. And there's an exemption under 230 for federal law, for federal criminal law. Okay. So when they're highly motivated to do it and they can define it, they stamp it out. Okay. What we're seeing in coronavirus is that they being Twitter and Facebook and Google are being quite assertive when it comes to disinformation about coronavirus, in part because it's actionable. I mean, people are making decisions like, am I going to put this bleach or this, whatever, this chemical in my body? Am I going to go outside?
Yeah.
Am I going to go outside? Am I going to, I'm going to have my neighbors over? I mean, people are making actionable decisions with life consequences. And so what you see is a pretty assertive effort that involves lots of different things. And so I think a lot of people, on Twitter, like for example, a lot of people of color that I follow on Twitter are looking at that and saying, okay, great, now do hate speech. You know what I mean? In other words, so when you're highly defined, now, but there is one problem though there's a lot of problems, but there's a specific problem with misinformation and disinformation, is that what we're lacking is maybe both the will and the way. That is, we're lacking the motivation. They don't have adequate motivation, but also it is so hard to define these things. It is so hard to define what is misinformation and what is disinformation, that you do have to have some level of appreciation, maybe not sympathy, but you have to have some level of appreciation for how difficult it can be to disentangle the disinformation and the speech.
Right. I am speaking with Ryan Kalo for the Center from an Informed, I'll try that again, from the Center for an Informed Public. If you have questions, and I'm sure you do, just leave them in the comments and I will work towards getting to them. Ryan, I'm taking a look at these questions here, and I'm seeing Teresa is asking, should there be more accountability for those in authority or government that retweet or share fake stories or false information to the public?
In my view, absolutely. In my view, absolutely. I mean, so I think that one of the things that we talk about a lot at the center is the necessity of just slowing down. You know what I mean? And just like asking yourself, what is the provenance of this? Is this true? Is it helpful to share it? Because all of us, including politicians, can be vectors of misinformation. You know what I mean? And I think it's particularly incumbent upon political leaders to do that due diligence. And so a couple things. They shouldn't be, retweeting and amplifying these messages. If they do so, and then later on they realize that in fact it was misinformation, right? The best practice is that they should come clean about it, and they should take a screenshot of the misinformation, delete the actual tweet so it can't continue to propagate, so unretweet it or delete the tweet, but take a screenshot of it, put it up on your account, and say underneath it, this is what I found out, right? Because these folks, for better and often for worse, are supposed to be role models, and they're supposed to signal to us what the rest to do. So it'd be very powerful if politicians, thought before they did it, and when they get it wrong, which they do best practice when it comes to correcting me. Kate Starbird has really convinced me. And by the way, none of us are immune from this. I mean, I can give you several examples of times when I unknowingly spread disinformation, not disinformation, but misinformation. But what I have begun to do is to do that technique where I take it down, I stop it, I take a screenshot of it, I put down why I did that, and so on.
And what kind of reaction have you had when you do that?
Overwhelmingly positive. I mean, maybe not, there's some bad faith players out there who are you're always going to criticize, but if you really catch that you've done something wrong, and you cop to it and you explain why it is, I think people really appreciate that, and it's good modeling. When I do it, maybe nobody cares, but if Senator Rubio does it, it's a different thing.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that leads me to President Trump. And of course, it's hard to talk about Twitter without him. The impact he's had, the influence he's had with that platform is really quite remarkable. And things have not been, the relationship between Twitter and President Trump has not been smooth. And I know this was like about 25,000 news cycles ago, but at the end of last month, and this was just in May, Twitter started labeling President Trump's tweets and fact-checking them. You touched on this earlier. He responded with an executive order on that, and essentially going after the social media companies, saying that they were limiting speech. So my question to you then is, if I'm Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey, I guess I should say, should I be worried about that?
Well, we should all be worried about it because it is an attempt to put the government's thumb on the marketplace of ideas, right? I mean, and so we should all be worried about it in the abstract. But let me just back up and say, no, I'm going to try to rein it in here, Kim, because I am a law professor and I happen to teach administrative law. Okay.
Right.
But
Easy.
I will very quickly, I know you're going to lose people who are just like, don't unsubscribe yet. I'll do the best I can. I'll really fast. But it's important to understand that, what an executive order is. My screen has frozen, but I'm not sure if I'm still on.
Oh, hey, there you are.
There I am. Sorry, my screen. Maybe even Zoom, or even the platform we're using was like, no.
It was alarmed. It was alarmed. This administrative law professor is about to.
Let's freeze him. Very quickly, the truth is that Congress makes laws, and the executive executes them, right? An executive order is just a piece of paper that the president wrote out. You know what I mean? The executive order, unless there's an authority for the president to make a pronouncement that has the force of law, it doesn't. And so this executive order just says, hey, the Federal Communications Commission's got to make some rules, and the Federal Trade Commission's got to investigate, Twitter, and this is not okay, and this is not okay. It's meaningless. Everybody I've talked to that knows says this is just theater, okay? Mm-hmm. But even if it had the force of law, and by the way, the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Trade Commission are what we call independent agencies. So the president can't even remove the commissioners without cause. He doesn't get to boss them around. He doesn't get to tell the FCC what to do or the FTC what to do, let alone the state attorneys general. So it's a empty piece of paper essentially, but a dangerous one for what it means for the First Amendment. But even if it were real, it would be offensive to the First Amendment because the First Amendment limits what the government can do, not what Twitter can do as a private company, not what Facebook can do. So if people at Twitter want to comment on what the president's saying, the president can't stop them from commenting on what he's saying. You see what I mean? Right. That would be a violation of the First Amendment. I got to say, this was so straightforward that, like, at dinner, I asked my 9-year-old, hey, this is what the president did. Is this okay? And he said no. And I asked him why. And he gave those 2 reasons: because he doesn't make the laws and it violates free speech. You know what I mean? So if a 9-year-old is able to answer that. Anyway, sorry, I'll stop there.
No. Thank you for that. It's a question that I think we're hearing from a lot of people, which is that it seems that there needs to be some more teeth, some oversight into these companies, the way they handle their business, because people are being hurt. So what is the role of Congress here? Or is it even Congress? Is it perhaps the regulatory agencies? We're seeing accountability coming up in different institutions all the time.
Absolutely. And if Congress or a relevant agency, such as the Federal Trade Commission or the Federal Communications Commission, or the Federal Election Commission, wanted to pass rules that were narrowly tailored to addressing the harms, right? They could do so. And they can do more. And they can do things that hold the platforms accountable for enabling disinformation, for not having adequate ways to combat it, for not keeping records, right, of who is doing what on their platform and who is seeing what ad and those kinds of things. Those things are okay. Those things are less likely to fall, afoul of the First Amendment. What we have to be very nervous about is any government entity trying to be some kind of ministry of truth where nobody can say anything unless it comports with this, or or that Twitter and Facebook have to take down content because the government told them to. You know what I mean? That is inconsistent with the free speech tradition, and it's not anything you'll see me advocating, right? But the idea of having accountability measures, saying you have to have processes in place to catch this stuff. You have to have accountability for the kinds of ads you get paid for. You know what I mean? And there's also a really fascinating question. I mean, I made a joke about my 9-year-old. This is really complicated stuff. I should be really clear, and nobody has perfect answers to it in truth. It doesn't take a lot to figure out that the executive order is, just fantasy, but the space is a very difficult one. But one of the things to think about is, whatever we do, we have to make sure to do it in a way that doesn't abandon important foundational democratic values. And that's why it's important to proceed very, very carefully. But there's an open question about things like, given the fact that we know that Facebook and Twitter can make certain content rise and other content fall, right? At what point do those actions, those algorithms matching you with the content that they think that you'd like, or that's surfacing this content? One of the things I find so disturbing is when you see the lists of the most shared stories on Facebook, which they publish, how many of them are so questionable. You know what I mean? And so there's an open question as to, maybe they don't treat Facebook or Twitter like as the speaker of this content, but what does it mean for them to be the arbiters of what we see and what gets traction and what doesn't? You see what I mean? And that's an open, difficult question that I don't have an answer for.
Well, and it sounds like perhaps this is something where users actually have a role here, and it's not just something that regulatory agencies and Congress can deal with. There's a question here from Teresa, who's asking, is there a way regular users like us can influence or motivate platforms like Facebook and Twitter to hold authorities, especially accountable for spreading false or inflammatory pieces? And if I could just add on to your question, Teresa, if I may, hate speech as well. Is there a way to hold people accountable for that?
Yeah, so, I think that there's a misapprehension about the First Amendment where people think maybe anything goes. I mean, so you see Supreme Court precedents, like you see that not only were neo-Nazis allowed to march in Illinois, but they were given police protection. And you say to yourself, gosh, it must be that anything goes. And it's true that the government can't prevent you from saying even racist, odious things online. But you can't foment violence. You cannot encourage violence. You cannot threaten people. You know what I mean? You can't say things like, if you say that, you're going to have this terrible thing happen to you. You know what I mean? Like, and so there are limits. And so, hate speech, I think what most people are saying, what can users do? What can consumers do? I mean, you can just pressure these companies to actually follow their community guidelines, because they have gone far enough as to say, you can't say this, you can't do this. In theory, the kinds of racist, sexist, horrific vitriol that we see all the time on these platforms, in theory, a lot of it violates the terms of service. And I think I do indeed see a lot of complaints. It's anecdotal, but I see a lot of complaints on these platforms from women and people of color saying, I can't believe I got censored for saying this thing, you know what I mean? When I'm also experiencing this other thing, right? And so there's this thought of that the mechanisms that these companies have are both over and under inclusive, And the other thing you should know is that at least in consumer protection law, if a company makes a promise and it says, we're going to address this, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and then it doesn't live up to that promise, that can be misleading or deceptive for purpose of consumer protection law. So what you want to do is you want to get these platforms to commit to really policing their terms of service well. And when they don't, you want to make that the basis of a violation of the laws that say that they can't be deceptive and they can't be misleading.
Ryan, it sounds like you're saying it may be time, it may be past time. I don't know. I don't want to put words in your mouth, that we as individuals maybe should be starting to take some more responsibility for what's moving past our eyes as we surf these different platforms in our feeds.
Sorry to interrupt. I would say it a little bit differently than that, right?
Okay.
So I think there is often, at least I've been studying privacy for a long time. And in privacy, there is such a burden placed on the consumer You know what I mean? Read the privacy policy and opt out if you don't like it, and choose this other device if you know what I mean. It's all of this burden on us as individual consumers. And that's why I think a lot of people, including major companies like Microsoft, are calling for national privacy legislation. You know what I mean? So I don't want to say that it's, you know, I think these platforms and, you know, need to take a big line share of responsibility for what's going on, because their business practices and their platforms are what's enabling these lies to get halfway around the world before the truth gets its shoes on in a modern environment. I will say, though, that if we're going to have a solution to this, it's not going to be a single thing. It's going to be a range of ways to address the problem. And one of those is, yes, to educate people about how to be more discerning consumers of information, and to you know, I don't know if you ever heard the old adage, you know, measure twice, cut once.
Of course.
You know,
yes.
yeah, but really to think, you know, before you click, to think before you retweet, and to not, to the best of your ability, you know, not be part of the problem. You know what I mean? But it shouldn't be all on individuals. I mean, come on, we're especially now. I mean, we're home with our kids. We're trying to. Some of us don't have employment. We're worried. We're anxious. We have huge cognitive loads. Like, it can't just be on us as individuals to, hey, just smarten up, right? But I do think that media literacy and some of the techniques that we try to teach at the Center for an Informed Public are important, and that we have to be part of the solution. But it can't just be us.
Yeah. And I will just say that we do have links to resources, media literacy, the toolkit. They're all attached to this episode, and you can also find them at kuow.org. Ryan, this is a time like no other that I can remember, just the confluence of news events that are affecting so many people at the same time. People want information in order to help make decisions about what's right for them and their families. So as we're heading into this presidential election year, and there seems to be an opportunity for people to cast a vote for on particular issues. I mean, is there anything you'd like to leave us with when it comes to? I'm thinking about, you know, what will it take? We're hearing calls for reform everywhere, and I'm just wondering, is there anything that you see that's a sign of hope in this field, in your field, when it comes to this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of signs for hope. I mean, I think the fact that you know, I don't know if viewers know the history behind, like, the Center for an Informed Public, for example. But you know, what happened was that a large foundation that has historically been supporting of journalists, and is partnered with KUOW, the Knight Foundation, decided to invest in a number of big organizations to try to, you know, get traction on disinformation. And in doing so, by investing in the University of Washington and other places, has begun to kind of build a really robust field around misinformation. And I should be clear, people have been studying, like, propaganda and emergencies response, all these things for a long time, but it's becoming like its own field. And I think that all these people studying misinformation, all these journalists covering it in a dedicated way, I think it's beginning to make a difference. So I'm really hopeful on the sort of getting our hands around it. We have seen much more aggressive behavior on the part of platforms to try to address it. And I think the fact that, like, lives are on the line, and also social justice is on the line, you know, has really sort of lit a fire under some of the platforms and the policymakers that keep them accountable. I don't, some people have faith in sort of artificial intelligence is going to solve this for us. You know, we're just going to have some super AI that goes and finds all the bad stuff and gets rid of it. I do not share in that optimism. So that's not one of the tools that I think is going to be useful. But I do think that, you know, public awareness, deep and sustained study by lots of people in lots of disciplines, organizations like KUOW, making toolkits and having sustained coverage and being a trusted place. You know, I think all those things are hopefully starting to make a difference. I don't think that 2020, it's a prediction of my own, but I don't think that 2020 is going to be a repeat of 2016. I think it's going to be a repeat in the sense that there will be efforts, very concerted efforts to disrupt the election and foment dissent. And even, I've seen things from like telling people to go to the wrong place where the polls are not there, or vote on the wrong day. All this will happen, but I don't think it'll be a repeat of 2016 because I think a lot more folks' eyes are open to this possibility.
All right. We'll check back in with you about that if you don't mind, Ryan. It'd be great.
Please do. Please do.
To get caught up on that. Ryan KUOW is a principal investigator at the Center for an Informed Public and associate professor at the University of Washington School of Law. Ryan, a great conversation. Thank you so much for this.
Thanks for your great questions. I appreciate it.
From everyone at KUOW and our partner at the Center for an Informed Public, thank you so much for joining us for Stand with the Facts. You can visit kuow.org/standwiththefacts to access that toolkit. It's got links and resources on spotting misinformation and how to address it. Now, next time on Stand with the Facts, we're continuing on Tuesday, June 23rd. It'll be at 1 in the afternoon with Carl Bergstrom. He and I are going to discuss ways to sort through the abundance of information during a pandemic, as well as why the confusion around events like COVID-19 lead to the spread of misinformation. And you can register for that event and watch past events at kuow.org/standwiththefacts. Thank you, everybody. Take care. See you next time.